Okay, I think it's about time to start. Last session of the day, I'm very happy you are still with us and that you came to my talk. I'm very excited to be talking about this. I'm also very excited to be talking with more people about this. The 6 cons of world building, an approach I came up with and I'm very happy to share with you. So let's start with the least interesting part. Who am I? My name is Gerben, or Gerben works just fine. I'm based in the Netherlands, and I work under the name Multiverse Narratives, because I figured Multiverse Narratives is easier to pronounce than Gerben Grave from Groningen. And I'm also the co-founder of the Game Bakery, which is a cooperative of game devs in the Netherlands who are all working together in the same co-working space. Synergy, learning from one another. It's a very, very cool place to be. What did I work on? A couple of games. Most recently, I worked on Age of Wonders 4. I did some narrative events for that. I also worked on mobile titles. I worked on We Were Here Forever. I'm making my own games, such as Eloquence at the center, top center, in which you learn a symbol language by grabbing any phrase that you find in the game, putting it into your backpack, and then speaking it back to other people. And the top right is Universe. That's an actual theme park that I was the story director for a year. And that's when I first started thinking about world building and how we can build better worlds, I think, by connecting the inhabitants of that thing. Anyway, let's dive right into it. Because we're going to talk about world building, and that's very cool and very exciting. And I think over the last 2 decades, more or less, we've seen a shift from focusing on stories to focusing on story worlds. We've been training our audiences to engage in story worlds, to find the secrets of the story worlds, and to make them hungry for more. You can see that in TV, media, such as Game of Thrones. Of course, this story world in itself had a lot of tales to tell, and now we'll never get rid of the spin-offs probably until the end of times within this world. But in games, of course, lots of story worlds to dive into, the Warcraft world, and also Assassin's Creed. It's a very cool concept, right? A world that you can just jump into, get immersed in, have all these different angles to look at. And when I started teaching at a University of Applied Sciences in the north of the Netherlands, I found a lot of students who were very passionate about world building. At least that's what they talked to me. I was a narrative designer. I came in and they were like, wow, that's cool. And I'm very into world building. And I noticed that they focus a lot on like Tolkien-esque world building, Harry Potter, anime, lots of producing content, lots of creating characters, and so on. And it got me thinking, and I had some reservations about what world building actually means, because it's kind of hard to find like a proper method of how to build a world, let alone how to build a world properly. So I was thinking about when do you end? At some point we had a guest speaker, and I asked him the question as well, and he worked in movies. And so when do you stop building your worlds? And he said, never. And I was like, no, don't tell the kids that, because that's what they'll do. So when will you stop? And at the same time, I noticed these worlds are quite static. They're like a fixed position in time. Nothing really happens in the meantime. There was a lot of content, but there was very little substance. So how could you add more? How could you insert more message into your world? And does it facilitate narrative formation? So is your world an incubator for narratives, for stories, or is it just something that you create and then put in a drawer and can forget about? Around the same time, one of the games I've been playing for about 16 years, Lord of the Rings Online, I also noticed some changes in the way that they approached world building, in the sense that they started out with very consistent, I think, maps, and you can tell this is one zone. And then they were releasing zones that look more like this, which is a very stitched together approach. I still love the game, go play it. But I noticed this is less coherent, this is less consistent than what they made before. So all of these thoughts just stewed in my head, and I got thinking. And if you want to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend the talk by my friend Annie Walsh of AdventureX last year, A Pocket Guide to Godhood on World Building. He tackles some of the same questions that I will do in this presentation. He comes at it from a slightly different angle, but I highly recommend it. So before I show you what my suggestion would be or how I approach world building, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So what I offer is something that helps you build cohesive worlds. It measures interconnectivity, and it's a tool set that allows you to get the reverse expansion of that. It's not a substitute for your own creativity. So in terms of content, what the world actually will cover, that's up to you, and it definitely is no substitute for meaningful content. The examples I'm going to show you I made in Graph editor. There's other tools you can use for building worlds. You can write one document, you can create a wiki, but I think it's important to have some kind of linking in there to link your content to other kinds of content, but we'll get to that. So, what are the 6 cons of world building? The first one is concept, and it's kind of at odds with constraints. Both of these will produce content. And then you add connections, you insert conflicts, and you end with the consequences. And now these consequences will loop back into your content, so you have a loop you can go through, and I hope that you can tell by the end of the presentation that this is also a very collaborative approach, or that facilitates collaboration very easily. So I'll take you through all of these cons one by one, hopefully within the hour, and so that we have some room for questions. So let's get started. The first one is the concepts. I'm not going to dwell on this very long. There's other talks, there's other sources that you can consult on how to come up with a concept, but the concept to me is your idea for building a world. You can have a world in which dragons fly across the skies and giants roam the hills, or you can focus on a world that's centered on a home that's building a world within a different time with different values. And you want to make sure that you have your concept manifest in that world. So this is your own creative solution, your creative wish, perhaps, to what you want the world to be. And when you're describing this world, this is my tip for you, try to be economical in what you include. So whatever you don't describe, people will assume it's the same as current times, our world. So on the left side, and for Neverwinter Nights, you can tell they've put a lot of effort in creating this fantastical sphere. And on the right side, in Gone Home, they try to drive home what, because it takes place in the 90s, unless I'm mistaken, what the culture at the time was, what the counterculture of the time was. But you don't have to tell what the president was at the time, or what country you're in, and so on. Focus on the things that differ from our own world. That's it for concept for today. Moving on to constraints. So these are all the things that you cannot do. And I come from game development, so I will think of this as a game world, and you have to be mindful of the gameplay, verbs, the audience, the budget, and so on. It's like, no, you cannot do this. This is the box in which you can create your world. And so this is the reality of things. So you might think that concept and constraints is like a big rumble, and you're constantly at odds with one another, but I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think concept and constraints will have to be in agreement with each other, and whatever you end up with become your rule set for your world building. And then you can use those rules to test if anything that you add to the world still confirms to your rule set. Is it in line with the concept? Does it fit within the constraints? If it's green light for both, then you're good to go. So it helps you keep on track, basically. So this is one of the big ones, content. So actually adding stuff to your world. And to do that, I was thinking about how can we quantify Storyworlds, or the content of Storyworlds. And I was thinking about narratives that you can add. I was thinking about maps that you can add, and timelines. I think these are the 3 manifestations of entities and Storyworlds that you usually find. This is from Heaven's Vault, an excellent game, you should play it. So let's have a look at these individual manifestations. I would describe narratives, come fight me after, as characters having a series of events in locations. And those outcomes probably affect other characters. So it's a very character-focused part of a world. Whereas a map is a collection of locations in relation to each other. They show where interesting events occurred, or where people lived, or places that matter a lot for people. And the last one, timelines or histories of your world. They are a sequence of events. They show causality, correlation. So to a certain degree, these are plots that you can look at. So when I was thinking about this, I thought, okay, there's a couple of recurring actors here. They come up in all of these. So maybe these are the building blocks of our worlds. The first one being characters. So these are the active agents. They can achieve change in your world. I like to focus on individuals only. Factions, I think, are more linked to locations or events, but they don't really make, you don't make a great story about a faction, about a tribe or whatever. You like to learn more about the heroes of the tribe, the king of a people who did something or who failed to do something. I also prefer not to include objects. I think these are usually attributes of characters. If you have very substantial objects, you can regard them as characters by exception, such as the One Ring or Excalibur. They are like very large items that play a huge role in their respective story worlds. Locations is the next one. So I'm going to refer to locations as blue squares. They are a physical space, places where events happen, and places that are meaningful to characters in some way or another. And the final one is events. And events are more than moments. They might be scenes. I like to think of them as something that you might read about in the newspaper. So they have to have some kind of effect on the world as a whole. And they can be embedded in other events. So at the same time as you are thinking about content, as you're adding content, you're also thinking about the connections. How do these nodes all connect with one another? And it's all connected. So the goal, my goal, is to build a connected world. So this is one of the graphs that I made in the YAdd software tool. And once you're getting started, every time you add a character, you add more story, you add more drama, you add a conflict of interest, potentially, or an alignment. Every time you add more location, you add more map. And when you add more events, you add more timeline. And then the trick is to not insert those in isolation or just linked to one entity, but to draw more connections between them, to prevent them from becoming too isolated and therefore not being impactful to the core of your world. You can have this kingdom in your head, and then at some point you might come up with a desert on the other end of the continent, but if there's nothing happening in the desert that will impact your kingdom, on which you have your story focus, then why start with the desert at all? Why does it matter? People don't care about this desert if they don't get to engage with it. So anytime you come up with a new faction or whatever, also try to link it with more nodes in your network. So maybe kings have rivalries, or merchants travel from one side of the continent to a different one. Locations are connected through mountain ranges or swamps, anything you can come up with to make it more relevant to the content that you already have. So there's a certain relevancy check that you need to have. Does it impact another node? It makes little sense to assign every tree in this picture a location node. The exception being, maybe there's one tree under which some important character proposed to their partner, or where an important battle was fought. So then you can choose to zoom into that location and add another one. So every time you add something to the world, you need to ask yourself the question, is this relevant to the rest of my content? If you don't do that, you run the risk of running out of time, out of budget, because you're focusing on the wrong parts that are not featured in the game or in your part of fiction at all. Let's look at an example. So I took one of the villages from Skyrim, and I mapped out all the characters, the locations, and events in this overview. This is a small village, so it's quite, I think it's not too complex of a map. And while there's a lot of things going on, I want to focus on this bottom half. This is where most of the characters are. This is where the houses are. I think you can tell there's not a lot of events happening here, so that's the red squares. And I think it's kind of telling for the world of Skyrim as a whole. There's not a lot happening in the world if you just walk through it. You're the only one with true agency in the world of Skyrim. So if you organize your world like this, especially in this particular tool set, then you can still add your content, the who of the characters, what they did, and so on top of those nodes. But I think it's very important to look at every node within the context of their surroundings. So using this tool gives you an immediate insight in how they are connected, which is important because, especially if you have a more important character in your story world, if something changes about this, you want to make sure that everything that's connected to the node also changes with it. If you change the age, if you change when they die, you want to make sure that everything that's connected to that character or to that location or whatever changes alongside with it. So by mapping it out like this, you can monitor how that flows. And this also makes it very insightful for collaborators to check what has been changed in your world, so they can adapt to that. A little bit about hierarchy. So you can have symmetrical relations, or you can have asymmetrical relations between nodes. For example, a parent and a child, I could suggest you would draw an arrow between those instead of a straight line. Same with a lord and a vassal to show who has the authority there. With events, you can add causality by drawing arrows instead of straight lines. And in locations, you can use multiple levels of zooming to show on what detail level you are working on. And then this also prevents you from having to connect every street with every street. You can connect a character with a street, and then they are automatically connected to the city, to the country, and so on. It saves you a lot of time, and it makes things a lot more readable, legible. I think the king of doing this, and they've been doing this for a long time, is Marvel. Every time they introduce a new hero, they try to link it up with an existing hero or an existing villain. And they also try to make sure that there's a little bit of backstory between them. So She-Hulk is the cousin of Hulk. I really like, where is it, the second one from the left? Guest starring Wolverine, and he's not happy about it. So, so every time they try to introduce something, you want to draw the connection, which sends a signal to the audience that it's okay, this is not totally new, you know part of this already. This is just here to, there's more for you to explore by reading these stories. This also transferred to the MCU, so you at first you had all of these small stingers at the end of the movies. Very little scenes that connected, that brought in a character from a different movie to the current one, or that projected what characters might come into the next movie, and so on. So they've been doing it very steadily for a long time, and that eased in the audience. It calmed them down. Don't worry, we got this, it's all connected. There's more to this world than you've seen in the last movie. So, I mapped out the entire phase 1 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all of the movies up until the first including the first Avengers movies. Maybe someday I'll go beyond that, but I also like to have some spare time. So this is a mess, right? You can see the connections, but it's also totally chaotic. So my tool has a function to cleaning up a little bit. You lose the overview of which nodes are the most connected, but at least you can make sense of the map right now. So let's just zoom in on this random part over here, and you can see there's all kinds of nodes here, all kinds of locations that are featured in the movie, the events of the various movies, and the characters. So obviously there's going to be less characters in this than there are events, because most of the characters are reused throughout the movies. But yeah, it's a cool map. And then what you can do with this is apply graph theory. So you now have lots of nodes, and all of them have different connections. And you can, for example, measure the closeness of these nodes. So this tells you which node, well, how central each node is compared to all the other nodes in the network. So this tells you that along the center of this network, that's where the action happens. That's a lot of nodes, a lot of actors, locations, events that have a lot of impact on other parts of the network. You can also measure for weighted connections. So it measures the connections, but also defines which connections are worth more. Or, and I think this is the most interesting one, the node betweenness. So these are nodes that connect different chunks of your network. So they act as bridges between different sections of your network. And I think you'll agree that there's 4 that jump out. So you have the big one over there at the top. That's Iron Man, Tony Stark. You have another smaller circle at mid-left. That's Captain America. And then you have a smaller one just down below, and that's Loki. If anyone who's seen the Avengers movies will agree that these are the central characters to this universe. There's also a big square over there. Can you guess what it is? New York. Yeah, very good. Because most of the movies take place in New York. So those are the focal points of that universe. Now I think the interesting part of that is that we know that Tony Stark and Captain America are very central to the story world. But if you're making a story world for a game, then this tells you, this gives you the information of what you've been focusing on for so long. And it can also tell you that maybe you've been focusing on the wrong things. So maybe you should spend more time in different areas of your network to make them more impactful for your story world as a whole. So I think this is very cool and gives you a tool to be more conscious about where you spend your work while adding to your story world. Another thing I wanted to discuss is organic structures by talking about Return of the Obra Dinn. I guess maybe this has some minor spoilers for the game, but not really also. So this is again a very organic way of structuring the network, and you can't make any sense of it at all. But I think you can tell there's some clusters going on. So there's some focus points of everything. And therefore, as always, we need to talk about Kevin Bacon. Or the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. So there's this theory that every one of us is connected to Kevin Bacon within 6 steps along the world. And this shows that Kevin Bacon himself is connected to a lot of people who are also connected to a lot of people. So when you're building a world, keeping this in mind, when you're making your world, it might be very tempting, because I told you to connect it with the other nodes, to connect all of the nodes with all the other nodes. But then that doesn't really tell you anything anymore. It doesn't tell you a lot about how strong the connections between those characters are. So ideally, you end up with something like this, a more clustered approach. You have families, you have clans, you have bands of warriors, and so on. And then you have a few Kevin Bacons in there that connect everyone to everyone else to act as those bridges in your full network. So organic structures is the way that real life works. We are not all connected. Well, maybe after this weekend we're all connected to each other. But you're not connected to everyone in your network. You have to use those bridges to get there. And then another thing you can do is rearrange your world. So this is still Return to the Obra Dinn, only now I mapped it along the location part of everything. So this is like a map that you find in the game, and then I arranged the nodes along the same way, and I tried to structure the rest of the nodes along the same way. So you can tell, but by organizing your network differently, you get different insights in how your network can function. Time for conflict. So you have your interconnected nodes, you have your network, and now you want to mess things up a little bit. You want to make it less static, you want to add some dynamics in there. And I think that a way to do that is to focus on conflict. Of course, there's different kinds of conflicts. To keep things simple, I want to say that conflict drives story. At least it pushes people into having to develop to overcome whatever obstacle they face. But it doesn't have to be a violent conflict. It doesn't have to be a conflict with someone else. It can also be, an emotional conflict, some kind of internal struggle. And I think that conflict boils down to some kind of values that clash. And those values can be within the same order or within a different order, and I'm going to explain later on what that means exactly. But conflict can be defined as some kind of values that clash with one another. So, and during my studies, I read a lot of Bourdieu, which is a French sociologist, and he introduced this idea of field theory. He thought of the art industry as a field on which every participant within the art industry is a player, and everyone is trying to get the best position that they can and keep the position. So it's about relative position. And he said that to get a better position, you want to accumulate capital. This can be financial capital, or it can be symbolic capital, so you get the best reviews, for example, if you're a writer. But everyone's trying to elevate their own position and to become stronger on the field, because then you have more authority. There's a whole theory to that. I can recommend it, but it's quite lengthy. What I want to focus on is if you have more capital, if you have more influence, it's also very likely that you have more connections. People will connect to you more, and you can, through those connections, impact even more people. So the more connections you have, the more impact on the world that you have. So to give you an example, you have a king and you have a peasant. The king will have more connections to begin with. Probably the peasant might have a few due to geographical reasons. And then those connections of the king will connect to other people, so he has a lot of reach, and the peasant might find it hard to connect with other nodes in the network. So this, you can then signify how to work within your network by increasing or decreasing the size of your node. So you've seen this before in my MCU charts. The bigger the nodes are, the more impactful they are to your network. Bourdieu also describes how transition of power works. So at some point, the small peasant will get upset with the king, and he will gather some mates, and they will try to depose him, get rid of him, and then the cycle continues, because at some point, one of the peasants will rise up and become the next leader, and at some point he too will be removed by someone else. You can also see this in the real world by looking at waves and in the music industry, or in how certain poets get to get themselves in the picture. So at first, all of these, the indie music groups would band together and fight the man, Rage Against the Machine, and they will collectively challenge the power, the status quo that is in place. And then once they are the new authority, then they will begin to quarrel amongst each other. No, you're not a real punk, man. We're real punk. Things like that. So you have all of these dynamics going on in real life, and you can use that to change the situation in your story world. Then there's two more French sociologists that I want to introduce, Boltanski and Thévenot, and they are talking about 6 orders or 6 worlds. So they introduced 6 forms of capital, 6 forms of worlds that we are all living in at the same time and all the time. Although some of us might have more affinity with one value or the other. So inspired is the one that focuses on you wanting to elevate yourself, learning new knowledge, become a holy man or woman. It's a very internally facing value. Domestic is about family in the broadest sense of the word. It can be like an actual family with parents and children, or it can also be a feudal family as a king with his vassals, or something like a mafia family with people at the head, and you have to protect the family. The family is the most important part within the world of the domestic. Fame is about getting recognition from your peers. The market is about getting as much money as you can. That's the most important part. People who are full in the market will sell their own mother for cash. No questions asked. You can always buy another mother. The civic is about putting the whole, the collective, before your own needs. So the whole has to be preserved and to progress. And industrial is all about making things. Now, Boltanski and Thévenot were quite hardcore about this. They made this whole overview of symbols and tools used and what kind of, how important people function in the world. It's pretty fascinating, but it's probably too much for you to use. I think you can use values in your world to facilitate conflict. And you can exchange these values, or you can add values to the world whenever you see fit. So in a fantasy world, magic might be a good value to add here. So you can play around with these and assign values to people. Now there's something else that I wanted to say, but I forgot about that. So that's a pity. Maybe it'll come back to me. So going back to Skyrim, if we apply the values, the orders of values to everything, you can say that there's a king and a peasant, a king and an underling in every value. So you have this dragon and the monks that serve him. You have this bandit queen and lesser criminals who are all trying to get the most money in here. Or you have a high king and lesser kings beneath them who are in the domestic world. So these are all power struggles within the same order of value, right? But then at the same time, you will have the power struggles between those orders. So a king of the land will also be the king of the peasants within the world of the market. The bandit queen might have lended the king a lot of money, so the king might think, yes, I'm the king, but then the bandit queen will be like, yes, but you owe me a lot of money, so actually I owe you, which is true within the world of the market. So it's all about perception. It's all about how you see yourself within your own world, and then you have a conflict about which value will prevail at the end. So thinking of your nodes as actors within different values and assigning like a main value can help you insert more conflict. And once you have that conflict in there, you can use the outcome of conflict to add more dynamics to your world. So the network is a very diachronic representation of your story world. It's not fixed in one moment in time, but you can include a lot of different periods in there. Heroes who became kings, who were ousted again, and so on. The final con I want to talk about is consequences. Let's talk about consequences. Ooh, going too fast. So I think that what you see in the game should be the consequence, the result of all of the preceding cons. It's a variant of show don't tell, because I want you to restrain from wanting to explain too much about your world, because I think it's very tempting to, when you invite people to join your world, to talk a lot about the systems and talk about a lot of about how there are dragons everywhere, and you might be tempted to put up a post with a sign, beware dragons and so on, because you have dragons in your game. But the consequences of having dragons in your game, I think, make for a far more interesting representation of your world, because you can have watchtowers all along the mountain range with scouts looking at the sky to see if dragons are flying around, burn down villages or burn down fields because the dragon has been flying over. So you don't talk about the concept of the world, but you talk about how those consequences manifested in the world that the player encounters. So all of these consequences should either challenge or complement your concept and restraints. If they don't match, there's something has gone wrong along the way. If they do match, then maybe you can feed back into your concept and constraints to add more content within your rule set. I also think that focusing on consequences make the field more lived in. It becomes less brainy, less of an intellectual exercise of what if cats could fly and so on. Show your players what it means when cats can fly. Are mice totally extinct? It's interesting questions that you get to answer in your world. One of my favorite examples of this is the character of Nux in Mad Max Fury Road. So in Mad Max Fury Road, for those of you who haven't seen it, there's a lot of world building going on. It's a very strange world, but nothing is explained about the world. Everything that you learn about the world building is through the consequences of all of these steps. So you see at the top left page, you see Nux showing some kind of reference to a symbol like this. And that's because this mimics a V8 engine, which is very important to this culture that he's in. They never tell you that, but they do show you that they are doing this. And you can draw the connection between, okay, they are so involved with V8. Bottom left, Max asks Nux if he's a black thumb. And you don't know what a black thumb is, but he nods and he goes down into the engine and he starts fixing things. So apparently black thumb is, you have a black thumb because you're fixing engines and you're a mechanic essentially. So I think this is a very compelling example of how focusing on content, because Mad Max Fury Road has been praised for its world building and for how it shows this world and how it draws you in. So I think it's a prime example of why you should also focus on the consequences and not on telling people about kings and so on, but showing people how having kings affects the land. I think consequences are a perfect way, can be perfectly shown through lore. Of course, when you say lore and video games, you're talking about Dark Souls. So Dark Souls doesn't really have, well, it has a story, but it doesn't really tell you a lot about the story. And most of what it tells you is done through item descriptions, item lore. Not sure if that's legible here. What I think is there are some exceptions, but most of the lore on items seems to focus on a single character and tells you more about what that character did or what they wanted to do, which is fine, but I would like to see it connect that character more within the rest of the world to show what that character's place in the world is and how it relates to other powerful factions or entities in that world. So what I tried to do when I was writing lore for We Were Here Forever is to make sure that I'm always talking about different characters or how those characters relate to events that happen in the world and what locations were used. So this didn't make it into the game, but I still wanted to share with you that this is truthfully my approach to how to make lore and build worlds in the gaming space. So in conclusion, the seventh con, you start with your concept, some kind of intrinsical need you have as a writer, some kind of world that you want to build, your own unique game world idea. Then you are faced with the constraints. There's only so much you can do in so much time, so limitations based on whatever project you're working on. You add your content, you insert characters, add locations and events, and you immediately also connect them. Doing so helps you keep it relevant. If you can't connect some kind of content to your existing network, you need to ask yourself, do I really need this? Are there bridge nodes missing here? How can I keep it relevant? Then you can add conflict, so you add a layer of values and dynamics on top of that. And then at the very end, you show the consequences in your world. You don't tell the concepts. Now, I'll be honest with you, I don't use all of these steps every time when I'm asked to work on a world, but it does help me. I keep all of these steps in mind. So whenever I'm asked to introduce a new character, I want to make sure that it's connected so that it feels grounded in the world. And I don't add something. No man is an island. Everything has relationships to other things within a world. So keeping this in mind will make sure that everything that you add is kept relevant. Mind the rules, and the most important part is, I think, that people care about people and pets for some weird reason. But people don't want to hear too much about some kind of stone tower that was erected so long ago. People want to know why the tower is important to your hero, or why the tower, what role the tower played to some kind of secondary character to help them undergo this emotional journey. So focus on people, and you should be fine. And finally, as world builders, please build worlds that make ours a bit better, because I think that's what we need in this day and age. Thank you very much. Let's stay connected. Even if you don't have a question, please walk by in a bit, because I will have a stroopwafel for you to take home. And they're very good. But I went through this very fast, so we have quite some time for questions, I believe. Thank you. Yes?
I'm sorry, what was the name of the tool that you used to make the node map?
I can pull it back up. All the way back. Almost. Nope. There we go. why add Graph Editor? Yeah. If someone knows of a better tool to use, please tell me. Yeah, yeah, you can set it to measure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Question. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I have some thoughts on that. I think you should start when you're building a world with one character, one location, and one event, and make sense of how they connect to each other. Then add a few more, and also make sure that they all connect. Of course, when you start out with a concept, you will have some ideas of factions, and this king goes over there, and you have a thief over here. So you can write those down, but make sure that you find ways to connect them in a geographical manner or in some kind of causality manner soon. And I think it's a lot easier to build worlds by taking on one node at a time than by trying to deconstruct the Marvel Cinematic Universe like I did. I think it helps you retain insight in what's happening in your world, and especially when you're working with some collaborators, other writers on a project, and you check in and you see, oh, there's more things added, then you can tell how they are connected. So whenever you add something to a node that they are connected to, you can read up on what's been going on there. So there's less risk of people, one person writing in that direction, the other person writing in that direction, and then you have to try and rejoin again. Does that make sense? Yeah? Cool. Yes? Yeah, also a French sociologist. We in the Netherlands really like our French sociologist. So she also studied Bourdieu, and she thought of a way of using like events as a way to measure developments in the art world. So she uses some very impactful expositions, for example, and then describes how those changed the way people used to look at art and look at art right now. So it's more of, because events can be a bit, I don't want to say confusing, but it can be hard to pinpoint what an event is actually. So I'm referencing her to give you some example of what an impactful event can be, and how to think of events as being impactful for not just their immediate context, but also a broader movement in, for example, the art world. Yeah. No more questions? I overcame you. Data overload. Thank you very much for being here. I really much appreciate it. And please come get your stroopwafel. Thank you.